Hello, Mariam. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well, or good afternoon, where you are. I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, good. Very good. Thank you so much for joining us. This is, as I explained, this is an interview series for Marsy's Law, affiliated with Marsy's Law, that we started years ago during the pandemic, and we've continued it ever since. And the motivation for it is to get behind the scenes with the people and their motivation that are involved in the victims' rights movement. And we've had so many people, including um, family members, survivors, and then attorneys and judges and elected officials and district attorneys. And we are so pleased that you are here with us today because you are almost a one-woman statewide force in the state of California.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, and definitely have an incredible team that does incredible work on behalf of victims. And we're just excited to be part of the victims' rights movement to make a difference in the life of crime victims in California.
Well, to get right into it, I want to talk a little bit about what did motivate you in the first place. You are at McGeorge School of Law, and could you tell us where that is and what university it's affiliated with?
Yeah, absolutely. So McGeorge School of Law is located in Sacramento, California. It's a wonderful law school. I chose it because I had a part-time program. I had two young kids before I started law school, so I wanted to go to school part-time while taking care of my family. And it was in the capital. It's a great school with a great reputation. I went through law school not really knowing what I wanted to do. My background's a little non-traditional. I have a bachelor's in chemistry, got my MBA, and then decided to go to law school. So wasn't really sure if I wanted to work for the government, start my own practice. All I knew is that I wanted to help people. I wanted to help give a voice to those who did not have a voice by advocating for them. My last semester in law school, I actually found out that we had a victims program here on campus, and found out that it had been around since 1984. So I started learning a little bit more about that program. And really what drove me to fall in love with victims' rights is listening to Meg Garvin in 2012. She was presenting at a conference, and I heard her talk about Marsy's Law, and it just clicked. Like, wow, what an injustice we're facing, where victims have these constitutional rights, and these rights a lot of times aren't afforded to them. So really found my calling in what she said. And here I am 10 years later, still at the Victim Center.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, as someone who went through the process myself and going to law school and passing the bar exam, I became a prosecutor, a homicide prosecutor in Boston. And when people are thinking about what they're going to do with their legal career, it's a challenge to any law student. But for someone like you, who had so many different avenues that you could have pursued, a chemistry background, a science background, an MBA, and of course you're also juggling a young family at the time. And it's really amazing that you found your calling, which turned out to be a little bit more than a temporary thing, which you're still involved in now.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love what I do. I love serving victims all across California because there's so much work that needs to be done to help victims navigate the criminal justice system, understand their rights in the criminal justice system, and make sure that the system is respecting those rights as they're going through. So it's truly an honor to go to work every day and be able to serve.
Yeah, and just to bring it back to when you first started in the victims rights area, you said you listened to a presentation on Marsy's Law from Meg Garvin. Meg Garvin, who, by the way, when we started this Marsy's Law, Why We Do What We Do interview series years ago, appropriately enough, Meg Garvin was the very first guest. And she was the very first person that really gave you your career direction, which is fantastic. And when you started out, Marsy's Law was fairly new in California. It passed statewide in 2008. And
Yeah.
could you tell us all a little bit about Marsy's Law? You say there are 17 enumerated rights in the California state constitution.
Yeah, exactly. So there's 17 rights, really expansive rights that are wonderful. Victims, unfortunately, even today, so many years after the passage of Marsy's Law, still have a difficult time understanding what Marsy's Law rights are.
Yeah, and if I could just stop you there for a second.
Sure.
One of the things that we do here at Marsy's Law is we've now passed this in so many states since California.
Yeah.
California was our first state in 2008. And one of the things that we do, which we find important, and I think that you underscore this with your organization, is we try to stay and help in the states and keep a presence in each state where Marsy's Law is passed to help the service providers and to help with the implementation
Yeah.
of Marsy's Law.
Yeah.
I'd like you to talk a little bit about why that is important in the service that you provide, not just to victims, but the way that you do it through service providers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Marsy's Law is a wonderful set of constitutional rights for victims. Unfortunately, we are lacking in enforcement for these rights. And there's a disconnect also in terms of who's responsible for making sure that victims are afforded these rights, are aware of these rights. Is it the DA? Is it the victim advocates? Is it a nonprofit group? So part of what we do is provide information to crime victims if they do reach out to us. And we are listed on the back of the Marsy's Law card as a resource. We provide them with information about what these rights are. And some of the rights have to be requested, as you're aware. So we provide guidance on best practices for request. And also for service providers, a lot of them are DA-based advocates, and we provide technical assistance. So we'll provide them with research assistance on victims' rights related issues as a way to help empower them as they're assisting victims in enforcement of these rights.
And when you talk about the Marsy's Law card, could you just walk us through from the moment that a victim is given the Marsy's Law card, and like you said, your information is on the back of this card, but also the information about the constitutional rights for victims are also on the card.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily easily understood by someone who is new to the process. And typically, when a victim is thrust into the criminal justice system, this is at a moment when they're traumatized. They're trying to process things. They want to know who the different players are in this new world known as the criminal justice system. And it might not necessarily, even if it were easily understood, be easy to comprehend what those rights are. So could you tell us a little bit about how you would suggest to victims what they do when they receive that card?
Sure. So of course, when somebody is victimized, as you said, they are traumatized and they are given a lot of paperwork. So I think for all system players, it's important for all of us as a community of service providers, whether government-based or non-government based, to highlight the importance of these rights to victims, because it's easy for them to toss the paper aside or forget about it. And then to help a victim really understand the importance of being proactive with these rights and not reactive. So we need to be proactive with requesting notice of hearings. We need to be proactive if the victim wants to be heard by requesting that. We need to be thinking about restitution, as soon as possible, so victims can start putting together all of their losses so that they can request restitution. So we really focus on being proactive with these rights and really walk the victims through what these rights are and which rights they want afforded to them, right? Some victims do not want to participate in the process. Others want to have full participation. So really meeting the victims where they are and helping them from that point on with the rights.
Right. And some of these Marsy's Law rights are automatic, and some of them are provided, quote unquote, upon request.
Yeah.
And I've heard you talk in the past in interviews that you've given about some very constructive, proactive things that a victim can do. For instance, writing a letter to a prosecutor saying they want to be heard at different stages in the process. Could you tell us a little bit about, and I know as a former prosecutor, you have a lot of cases, and sometimes if a case is going to be disposed of short of a trial during a plea, everything that's in that file is very, very helpful as a reminder. So could you tell us a little bit about what you instruct victims to do proactively in order to support themselves when the criminal justice system can become very busy for prosecutors?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the rights that really give victims engagement with a process do have to be requested. So it says upon request. Unfortunately, there's no guidance in the law about what upon request means. Who do you request it to? Is it the DA? Do you have to go ask the judge directly? When do you request it? Is there a specific timeline for request? And then how do you request it? Can you just pick up the phone and call your advocate and say, hey, I want to be heard, or I want to have notice of hearings? So we've put together a set of best practices that we recommend everybody let victims know, hey, if you want these rights, enforced, here's how we recommend that you request it. And the reason we want them to do that is we want them to have a paper trail. So that if the rights are violated later, it's clear that the victims had requested these rights. So we request or recommend that victims provide their notice of requesting the rights in writing, sending it to the DA's office through like certified mail, and then checking in with both the advocate and the DA, letting them know that, hey, I'm requesting these rights, and that it's in the file, so that if the victim requested to be heard at a plea hearing, the prosecutor can open the file and say, hey, okay, the victim requested to be notified and wanted to be heard at this plea hearing, but they didn't get notice. So let's go ahead and continue this so that we won't violate their rights. So it really is about being proactive instead of reactive. There is one county in California that has a certificate of compliance with Marsy's law form, and that's Nevada County. So Nevada County requires that either the DA or a victim's rights attorney at the earliest point possible submit a document to the court letting the judge know, hey, the victim requested, was the victim notified A, and then if they requested to be heard, to be notified, during the process, so that the judge is also on notice that the victim wants to participate.
Right, and one of these constitutional rights, this constitutional right under Marsy's law, actually allows the victim to directly address the court.
Yep. Absolutely. They have the right to be heard. And a lot of victims don't know that. A lot of victims feel like their only role in the criminal justice system is to give a victim impact statement. And that's not what our law says. That's not our Constitution. So victims have a much more participatory role in our process. And that's what gives them the feeling that they are an important player in the criminal justice system.
Right. And your service provides direct contact with victims through your hotline. I want to get into that in a little bit and how you've grown that. But also what you do is help service providers be able to translate this for victims, so that it's not just on the back of a Marsy's card and it's not just in legalese, what exactly it means, so that a victim can actually be an active participant in the process. Could you tell us a little bit about the trainings that you do? I know that you train people in law enforcement. I know that you train victim witness advocates and the different conferences. I know that you and I were talking about the fact that you do quarterly training. You just finished one, I think, in San Francisco last week.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that role and what you do.
Exactly. Yeah. So part of our mission is to educate service providers and the community in general about victims' rights. So, and I train victim advocates on Marsy's law because a lot of times it falls on their lap to make sure that victims are aware of their rights. So we go through the rights and go through specific examples of what these rights look like in real life, right? So the victim has a right to be protected from the defendant. What does that look like? What are some of the tools that you have to make this right a reality? The advocates really appreciate the information, because a lot of times, without being trained in the law, it's difficult for them to navigate what these rights really mean and how they can make sure that victims are afforded these rights. We also present to community-based agencies. A lot of victims don't feel comfortable reaching out to government-based agencies for one reason or the next. So we also provide the same training to community-based agencies. Law enforcement, we've done roll calls at law enforcement, really highlighting the importance of this card. Like, this is why this card is really critical for victims, because this helps give them the power to participate in the criminal justice system. Alongside Meg Garvin recently did a training at the California District Attorneys Association conference as well in Palm Springs, also on Marsy's law. Just putting the information out there. My goal is for the community as a whole, including service providers, to be as aware and knowledgeable about Marsy's law as they are about Miranda, so that we have, an equal playing field for victims.
Right. And one of the things that we talk about a lot, that I talk about around the country when we talk about Marsy's law, especially when we go into a new state and we're educating people both on the prosecution side and the defense side, is that the fact that meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights are afforded to victims does nothing to take away the important constitutional rights of defendants, like you said, Miranda warnings and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, victims' rights are not there to take over the criminal justice system. They're not there to create an unfair system for the defendants. as an attorney, I believe that we need a fair system, and the criminal justice system should be fair for everybody that's involved. So victims' rights do not in any way impede the defendant's rights. Victims' rights are not about controlling the outcome of the case. They're just about controlling the fairness of the process, making sure that victims have the ability, if they are interested, to participate in the process, to be heard, to be notified, to get restitution, to be protected, etc. And that really does not have any impact on the fairness of the trial for the defendant, or impact the defendant's rights as they're going through the process.
Yes, and you and I talked a little bit about the whole criminal justice reform system, and when you talk about victims' rights in that context and through that lens, some people believe that when you talk about victims' rights, that it has more to do with retribution and convictions than actual justice. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the idea of meeting our victim where they are, right? Because justice means something different to every single victim that I've worked with over my career. And I'm sure you've experienced the same. So we really need to understand what the victim that we're working with is looking for in terms of justice, in terms of resolution. And a lot of victims don't want retribution. They, want to just understand why. And in those moments, we can think about some restorative practices that can be incorporated in the system. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done to reform our criminal justice system, because the way it stands now, it's unfair for the defendant and definitely unfair for the victim. So meeting our victim where they are and thinking about ways that we can help them attain that justice that they're looking for.
Now, in California, you talked about the CVRC, the Criminal Victims Resource Center, starting as a statewide entity at McGeorge almost 40 years ago in 1984. So you guys really have been onto this for quite some time. Now I want to just fast forward a little bit to when you first started. You were kind of all by yourself.
Yeah, I was. And
what you've grown it into.
Yeah, so the program is grant funded. So of course, as any grant funded program, funding goes up and it goes down. So when I joined fresh out of law school, had just passed the bar, the program was lacking in funding. We were kind of at a really low point with funding. And there was a thought that the program was going to shut down due to lack of funding. So it was only myself and just law students answering the statewide hotline, providing information to victims through that hotline and through email. Once I started, I really started reading, we're mandated by penal code. So I started really investigating, well, what is our purpose in this program? What's our mission? What are we supposed to be doing? And really felt like we're sitting on a gold mine, there's so much opportunity to affect change for victims' rights on a statewide level, by working kind of being ahead of the technological wave. So incorporating chat, incorporating like an SMS enabled hotline, et cetera, into our program to make sure that we're reaching all the victims, no matter how they want to contact us. So started really applying for more grants, and thankfully we're able to grow the program now. We have 7 full-time staff members and about 6 law students that are working now, providing information to crime victims through our hotline, through our chat, through our SMS. And we also have publications on our website that all written in plain language that victims can request, service providers can request, to help educate them about victims' rights, to help educate them about the criminal justice system. We also launched a podcast recently, and the podcast is there to provide information to victims and service providers about victims' rights and also victim services.
So now the CVRC started when you went and started there basically as one person. It's now not just a legal center at McGeorge, but it's also the website, which includes the hotline and a podcast. And the podcast is called Knowledge is Power, Victim to Survivor. Is that it?
Exactly. Knowledge is Power, Victim to Survivor.
And are you is that in English only, or are you working on translating that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first 2 seasons we have are in English, but we have the audio in Spanish as well, if anybody needs this audio in Spanish. The 3rd season is actually fully in Spanish. So my team is recording right now, interviewing people from various agencies, victim compensation, victim witness in Spanish, and getting information out there for victims who are not English speaking, to make sure that they have equal access to the information that we're sharing over the podcast.
And so everyone is aware it's 1-800-victims.org, right? Is the
Yep,
website.
exactly. 1-800-victims.org, and then 1-800-victims is the hotline.
1-800-victims is the hotline. And you actually on 1-800-victims.org, there's also is there also because of the fact that when people are trying to access this, could you tell us a little bit about what you have built in there with respect to safety? Because sometimes, especially in a domestic situation,
Yeah.
somebody might be in the other room. Somebody might have access to the computer. Could you tell us about what safeguards that you've implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do want to make sure that as victims are accessing our information that they are safe. So we have an escape the site button, where if a victim's on our website and they just click that button, it'll take them out of our website and then erase it from their history. So they won't be able to, the abuser wouldn't be able to see that they were on our website. And that's for victim protection, and that will go with the victim to every single page that they're on our website. And we also provide a warning at the beginning when they first join to let them know the risks of, using the internet, how things can be monitored, and how to stay safe. We have the entire statewide resource directory on our website as well. So if somebody doesn't feel comfortable calling us, they can find resources directly from our website. They can email those resources to themselves. Information about the services provided at those resources, contact information, directions, etc.
Yeah, I saw that on the website. It's really incredible how comprehensive it is, and you guys really have thought of everything.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We really try. And, because we help victims of all crimes at all stages of the criminal justice system, I feel like we have a bird's eye view of the state of victims' experience in the criminal justice system based on the feedback that we're getting through the hotline. So we really try to incorporate the feedback that we get about the victim's experience and create publications and make our services accessible based on that information.
Yeah, it's very easily understood, easily digested. And I went on and I was looking at the website, right down to even post conviction. There's a difference. A lot of people wouldn't understand. There's a difference to trying to find out what happens to the perpetrator if he were incarcerated in a state prison as opposed to a local institution.
Yeah.
All of this is on the website. All of the different local resources are on the website with respect to who to call. And also, like you said, the downloadable information that really tells you who the players are in the process and what their roles are, who the judge is, who the prosecutor is. I've heard you speaking about in an interview, and one of the common misconceptions that I find when I speak to people is when victims talk about a prosecutor as their lawyer.
Yeah.
And as a former prosecutor, I like to think of myself as someone who's working as hard as I can on behalf of a victim and a victim's family. But technically, the role is the prosecutor represents the state or the Commonwealth or the government or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And so the victim has a unique role in the system, and for them to understand what each person's role is and for you to lay it out is so important to have that on your website.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that's an unfortunate part of our system is that victims aren't aware of the players and and their limitations, right? Like the fact that DA-based advocates don't have confidentiality, and that's part of what I incorporate in the training. Why is it important to let victims know exactly what your role is and what the limitations of those roles of the role is, so that they won't be devastated, right, by disclosing something that will later have to be disclosed because of Brady. So we want to make sure that we get that information out to victims so that they can make informed decisions about who they're talking to, what they're talking about, and they don't get re-victimized as they're going through the criminal justice system.
Yes, and one of the things that that you do as well, and I wanted to talk about this as well, in addition to the work that you do on the hotline, is you also teach a course on victims' rights, and so it's important for the prosecutor or the lawyer, if someone's going to go into defense work, to understand what victims are going through, as well as what victims' rights are, how important it is that these rights are now in the state constitution in California, what that means,
Yeah.
and what it means, what the limitations are with respect to investigations and defense investigations.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think is important is that lawyers need to know what their role is as either a defense attorney or a prosecutor or ultimately a judge, and what is expected of them, what their obligations are under the state constitution now because of Marsy's law. So you actually teach a course on victims' rights.
Exactly, yeah. So we are one out of 5 law schools across the country that offers a course in our law school specifically on victims of criminal procedure. And that's what I tell a lot of advocates, they assume that the attorneys they're working with are familiar with Marsy's law, but that's not the case. The case is that, only a handful of law schools have a course dedicated on the subject. And unfortunately, most law students, their encounter with victims in their crim law classes is limited to the fact pattern. After that, the victim pretty much drops off the face of the case and the discussion. So these students are graduating not really being informed or educated on the victim's role in the process and victims' rights. So teaching this course has been really one of the most meaningful things that I've done in my career because I see the impact that it has on students in my class who are currently in the DA's office, currently working at a defense firm. And it's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that victims had these rights. But now that I'm going to graduate and work at prosecutors' offices, work at a defense firm, I'm going to be much more mindful about these rights and try to make a change where I can to ensure that victims are afforded these rights.
And like you said, there's only a handful of law schools in the entire country that teach a course specifically dedicated to victims' rights. Some of the other ones are at Lewis and Clark, taught by Meg Garvin. Utah, which is former federal judge Paul Cassell.
Exactly.
And Arizona with Steve Twist, all of whom are very friends, good friends of Marsy's Law, and all of whom have been guests on this interview series. Why we
That's
do.
Amazing.
I'm so glad that you were able to join us. And one of the things that you talked about was how you don't want to see victims re-victimized.
Yeah.
And I think what you do is so important because you, instead of making sure that victims aren't re-victimized, you make sure that victims are empowered. In all of your work, whether it's through service providers or educating law students to be lawyers, perhaps in this space, or victims themselves through the resource center and through the hotline, all of your work is to provide knowledge.
Exactly.
And which all comes back to the name of your podcast of Knowledge is Power, from Victim to Survivor. So I just think your work is so important because you actually provide the information and the tools to have people make the transition from victim to survivor and ultimately to thriver.
Exactly. And it's an honor doing this work. And, I went to law school to help people. Our program is here to help people, to help empower crime victims. And I appreciate all of your wonderful feedback about the program. And we're there to help. We're free of charge. We don't charge anything for our services. Our services are anonymous and confidential. So it's our honor to be serving victims because they should not be mistreated as they're going through the criminal justice system. They should not leave the criminal justice system feeling disempowered, feeling like they were victimized again. They should be on their journey to healing at the end of the criminal justice system.
Well, I want to thank you. You really have set the standard. You're a model for, like I said, the states where we have passed Marsy's Law, for us to stay and maintain a presence to make sure that Marsy's Law is actually implemented in the right way to serve victims as best they can, like you're doing in California. So I just want to thank you for setting such a great standard and example for everyone in the country.
Well, I really appreciate that. And thank you for all of your work getting these laws passed. Because without these laws, we wouldn't be able to be doing what we do, empowering victims to make these rights and these laws meaningful to them as they're going through the process.
Okay, and one more time, can you give us your website and the phone number?
Yeah, so 1-800-VICTIMS, so 1-800-842-8467, and our website is 1-800-victims.org.
Fantastic. Mariam, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. I know how busy you are. And now you had 2 kids when you first started. You now have 4 on top of all your work. And it's a busy time of year. So thanks so much for taking the time to join us here in Marsy's Law.
Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do and for highlighting our program.
Okay. Have a great day.
All right. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.